sans amour, mais c'est vous qui l'avez voulu.
At 51, Vanessa Paradis finally said it aloud, the sentence that lingered in her for decades, like a whisper caught between two notes. He taught me that sensuality doesn't live in the body. It hides in sadness. The he was Serge Gainsbourg. And with those few words, an entire generation suddenly saw the secret architecture of her art collapse into a new shape. For years, Vanessa had been the face of effortless youth, the teenage muse who sang Joe Le Taxi with the nonchalance of a Parisian breeze. But behind that melody was the ghost of a man who had once reinvented desire itself through silence, provocation, and melancholy. Gainsbourg had written for her when she was only 14, sculpting not just her first song, but the grammar of her voice, a grammar of restraint, of breath and distance. The confession came quietly, in an interview that no one expected to hurt. She wasn't nostalgic. She was analytical, as if revisiting the anatomy of her loneliness. She spoke of a studio smelling of Gauloises and magnet tape, of his raspy voice whispering behind the glass, teaching her how to sing what cannot be said. In the late 80s, France celebrated her as innocence incarnate, never realizing that her purity was engineered from his darkness. Every whisper in her music carried a trace of his despair. Every pause was a syllable borrowed from his silence. Now, decades later, her admission rewrites the map of her life. The man the world remembers for Je t'aime moi non plus had, in a way, carved his philosophy into her adolescence, not through seduction, but through initiation. She didn't inherit his scandal, she inherited his solitude. The shock isn't in the revelation of influence, it's in understanding that her most delicate songs were never about love, but about learning to endure the absence of it. And as her voice echoes once again older, softer, wiser, it carries the same paradox he left her, that the truest form of beauty is the one that trembles. Because when Serge Gainsbourg taught Vanessa Paradis how to sing, he was really teaching her how to survive silence. Before she was a symbol of French elegance, Vanessa Paradis was a girl with a crooked smile, a ribbon in her hair, and a voice that didn't quite know what to do with its own fragility. It was 1987 when Joe Le Taxi began to float across the airwaves, a small, quirky song about a taxi driver, sung in a tone that seemed both innocent and weary, like a child humming a secret she didn't yet understand. France fell in love overnight. She was 14. The song was written for her, but also about her in a strange way, an invitation into the adult world that she wasn't ready for. Behind the catchy rhythm and tropical brass line, Serge Gainsbourg's ghost lingered. He had written for her, not as a man enchanted by a young muse, but as an artist recognizing another creature of fragility. He didn't give her instructions, he offered a mirror. For the public, Vanessa became la jeune fille de la chanson française, the embodiment of effortless allure. She was photographed under golden light, always half smiling, her gaze caught between defiance and shyness. To an audience raised on Brigitte Bardot and Catherine Deneuve, she was a return to something purer, quieter, the promise that France could still produce innocence in an age of irony. Her voice was never powerful, but it was unforgettable. It didn't rise, it trembled. Gainsbourg had told her, "You don't need to shout to be heard." And she obeyed. Her tone became an exercise in restraint, every breath placed like a comma, every whisper allowed to carry what words could not. On television, she laughed nervously, answering questions about fame and beauty as if they were math problems. She didn't yet know that the industry would build her persona on that delicate discomfort, that the same fragility that made her adored would one day become her cage. Throughout the late 80s, The world projected light onto her. Her face appeared on magazine covers, her name next to Chanel. Her image transformed into perfume ads and movie posters. Everything about her was luminous. But inside, she felt increasingly like a silhouette illuminated from behind. The collaboration with Gainsbourg remained a quiet footnote in the archives. A curiosity, the enfant star and the old master. Few knew that his words had left a permanent echo in her phrasing, that she had absorbed his philosophy of sensual melancholy like a secret religion. To him, beauty was always cracked, perfection was sterile. And she, with her natural imperfection, became the living proof of his creed. When Tandem arrived in 1990, written and produced by Etienne Rodeguil and Franck Langoff, it was clear that the seed Gainsbourg had planted had begun to bloom. The girl who once sang about taxis now sang about two shadows dancing out of rhythm. Her diction was more deliberate. Her silences heavier. It wasn't imitation, it was evolution. The sensual sadness had found a new voice. Interviews from that period describe her as mysteriously distant. But she wasn't distant, she was disciplined. She understood that true provocation was not in exposure, but in restraint. While the world expected a new Bardot, she gave them a paradox, a woman who could be desired yet unreachable, warm yet unknowable. There was a peculiar poetry in her ascent. Each performance seemed a stage not confidence but hesitation, as if she were perpetually on the verge of retreating into herself. It was this uncertainty that fascinated directors, photographers, and songwriters alike. They sensed that she was protecting something invisible, an inner silence that refused to be translated. Vanessa's success in cinema only deepened that illusion. In Noce Blanche, White Wedding, she played a teenager entangled with her teacher, an echo, perhaps, of every unspoken dynamic in French art, where mentorship and desire blur under the same light. Critics praised her emotional transparency, but what they were really seeing was control. She had learned early that emotion, to be powerful, must be sculpted just as Gainsbourg had taught her to sing a word by not singing it. By her 20s, she had become both muse and mystery. The public adored her because they thought they understood her gentleness. Artists revered her because they knew they didn't. She existed in that narrow corridor between exposure and silence, where everything feels like confession, but nothing is confessed. At photo shoots, she often requested the music of the 60s, the sound of vinyl, the hiss of tape. Those noises weren't nostalgia, they were memory. The analog imperfection reminded her of her beginning of the old man with the cigarette and the dangerous tenderness in his eyes, teaching her that every sound carries its own sadness, if you listen closely enough. The illusion of Vanessa Paradis, the sweet, eternal ingenue was a construction both luminous and fragile. Behind it, the real woman was learning to breathe inside the constraints of myth. She smiled for the cameras. Yes. But in her private notebooks, she wrote about silence, about loneliness, about the strange pressure of being a projection. The world saw a singer of pop songs. She saw a student of melancholy. And when people praised her for her grace, she smiled politely, knowing that grace was not a gift, it was something learned through endurance. Because what Gainsbourg had given her, beneath melody and metaphor, was not fame. It was vocabulary for sadness, for restraint, for solitude. He had taught her how to turn pain into tempo, how to make breathing a form of punctuation, how to transform absence into rhythm. And that was the illusion everyone mistook for light. The truth about Vanessa Paradis was never in the melody, it was in the pauses. What the public heard as softness was, in reality, the sound of self-defense. Every note she withheld, every silence she allowed. became a way of keeping the world at arm's length. It was Gainsbourg who taught her that silence can be erotic, that fragility can be armor. But he had not warned her about the loneliness that follows when you make a life out of restraint. In private, Vanessa wrote in small notebooks fragments, half sentences, lists of sensations: smoke, water, breathing, glass, distance. There were no rhymes, only rhythms. She once described writing lyrics as trying to translate a feeling that refuses grammar. And to understand her was to understand the unease between vulnerability and control, the constant negotiation between wanting to reveal and fearing the consequences. The early years of fame had aged her faster than the mirror. The tabloids called her angelic. Yet her eyes carried something unlearned by angels: caution. She smiled as photographers called her name. But behind the shutter flashes, she felt the pulse of an old refrain: protect, protect, protect. When Gainsbourg died in 1991, she was barely 18. She didn't attend the funeral. She said she couldn't bear the spectacle. Instead, she stayed home, listening to his voice on tape, rewinding the same phrases over and over, tracing the way he lingered on vowels. His death was not an ending, but a transfer of solitude. From that day on, every song she sang was a quiet conversation with his ghost. Years later, during a radio interview, she was asked about the word influence. She smiled, a small, tired smile. Influence, she said, is when someone leaves fingerprints on your silence. That silence followed her everywhere. It was there when she moved to Los Angeles with Johnny Depp, trying to reconcile two mythologies, the Parisian muse and the American dream. He loved her stillness, her refusal to chase fame. But what he loved was also what distanced them. For Vanessa, intimacy was built on space. For him, it was built on chaos. She sang about loneliness while living inside it. In the studio, producers sometimes asked her to sing louder. She never did. Louder doesn't mean truer. She'd reply. The microphone had become a microscope. It could hear every doubt, every breath, every hesitation. She knew that honesty in art wasn't about volume, but about vulnerability. And vulnerability, for her, was measured in decibels of quiet. The hidden truth was that Gainsbourg had not merely written her first song, he had written the emotional code she would spend her life deciphering. He had shown her that sadness could be seductive if you made it sing, that beauty could survive only when dressed in melancholy. But while he had turned pain into poetry, she was left to turn poetry back into survival. Fame, for Vanessa, was both blessing and bruise. On stage, the lights disguised everything: fatigue, heartbreak, fear. Off stage, the applause evaporated too quickly. She learned to depend on silence the way others depend on sleep. It's the only space, she once said, where I can breathe without performing. Friends spoke of her as warm but unreachable, a candle behind frosted glass. Her laughter was sincere, but it never lasted long. She always seemed to hear something distant, like an echo calling her back. That echo was the lesson of her youth. Art is not a way to escape loneliness, but a way to articulate it. When she recorded Tandem, her favorite line wasn't in the lyrics, but in the rest between them. That rest, that single measure of nothing, felt like her life compressed into sound. It was the breath between dependence and freedom, between child and woman, between the voice she was given and the one she was still inventing. Critics often labeled her enigmatic. They missed the point. The enigma was not deliberate, it was instinctive. For Vanessa, Mystery wasn't an aesthetic, it was self-preservation. She had seen what happened to women who gave too much of themselves to the public. Gainsbourg had written their stories, too. She refused to become another song that wasn't hers. Sometimes she spoke of him not as a mentor, but as a mood. He's everywhere, she said. In the shadows of the chords. In the way French sounds when it's tired. His presence was no longer literal but atmospheric, woven into the fabric of her phrasing. It was the artistic inheritance of melancholy, a lineage passed down not through blood, but through timbre. In her 30s, Vanessa began to understand the cost of that inheritance. Sensual melancholy is beautiful, but it demands silence. And silence, over time, isolates. The very thing that made her voice unique also made her difficult to reach. Lovers admired her serenity until they mistook it for absence. Audiences adored her stillness until they called it coldness. The world confused depth with distance. The truth, however, was simple. She felt too much, and she had learned to hide it inside the music. When she sang, she wasn't performing, she was translating emotion into geometry, carving meaning into rhythm, trying to make sadness symmetrical. There were nights on tour when she would leave the stage and walk alone through empty hotel corridors, her ears still ringing with applause. She described that moment as a beautiful kind of vertigo. The contrast between noise and silence was her private ritual, her reminder that art was not a cure but a mirror. The more she matured, the more her songs turned inward. Divine ideal. Love songs. Les Sources, each album felt like a diary written in code. The lyrics were fragments of confession disguised as lullabies. The production shimmered. But underneath, the heartbeat was always slow, deliberate, melancholic. In one interview, she was asked if she considered herself a happy person. She paused. Happiness, she said finally, is a short song. I prefer the long ones. That was the essence of her artistry and her inheritance from Gainsbourg. To her, music was not about expressing joy, it was about surviving the absence of it. Her songs were not confessions, but meditations. Not stories, but states of being. And yet, beneath all the discipline, there remained tenderness, a quiet gratitude for the man who had seen her potential, not as a product, but as a paradox. He had looked at her and recognized what the world would take years to understand, that beauty and sorrow can share the same chord. Even now, when she steps into a studio, she imagines him somewhere in the shadows, cigarette smoke curling like treble clefs, murmuring in that raspy half-voice, "Don't sing to seduce them. Sing to survive yourself." She obeys, as she always has. Because beneath the fame, beneath the fashion, beneath the decades, the hidden truth remains: Vanessa Paradis was never trying to be loved. She was trying to remain intact. It was during a documentary shoot, years after the world had stopped expecting revelations from her, that Vanessa finally spoke the sentence that turned every theory into clarity. She was sitting in an empty rehearsal room in Montmartre, a guitar beside her, the floor covered with lyric sheets. When asked what she had learned from Serge Gainsbourg, she didn't mention music. She said, "He taught me that loneliness isn't a condition, it's a rhythm. Once you learn to live by it, you never forget the tempo." That was the moment everything made sense. The soft diction, the careful phrasing, the invisible walls around her. Loneliness wasn't a scar she carried, it was the metronome guiding her life. For decades, people had misread her restraint as timidity, her silence as mystery. But the truth, the biggest shock, was that she had been performing an entire philosophy, Gainsbourg had composed his melancholy into her voice, but she had transformed it into survival. What began as imitation had become identity. In her notebooks, later published by a French magazine, one line stood out in uneven handwriting. He showed me that every melody has a wound. Next to it, a sketch, 2 lines running parallel, never touching. Beneath it, the word tandem. It wasn't nostalgia, it was testimony. The title of her famous song had always been a metaphor for them 2 spirits in the same vehicle, looking in different directions. The public never saw the private apprenticeship, how he would stop her mid-line and whisper, "No, not like that." Leave air between the words. Let the sadness breathe. Or how he once told her that a singer's true instrument isn't her throat, but her silence. She learned to treat each pause as a prayer, each hesitation as truth. But here was the paradox. In learning how to express absence, she had inherited his solitude. Gainsbourg's death had not released her. It had recruited her into the same religion of quiet despair. The teacher's final lesson had become her lifelong echo. In the documentary's closing scene, she hums a few bars of Tandem without accompaniment. The camera lingers on her face, the same delicate bones, the same restrained grace, and something extraordinary happens. You can hear the years between the notes. Her voice, still whisper soft, carries the texture of time, fatigue, tenderness. It is the voice of someone who has made peace with the ghosts that trained her. That is the revelation. Vanessa Paradis did not merely survive her past, she curated it. She turned the unbearable inheritance of Gainsbourg's melancholy into an art of her own. Where he sought provocation, she found purification. Where he turned longing into scandal, she turned it into sanctuary. When asked if she ever felt trapped by a shadow, she smiled faintly. "No," she said. His shadow was the first light I understood. The statement stunned even the interviewer. It redefined influence as intimacy, not romantic, not artistic, but existential. Gainsbourg was not her ghost, he was her grammar. Through him, she had learned to conjugate the unspeakable. And yet, the irony of revelation is that it often hides in plain sight. The clues had always been there in the whispering delivery, in the restrained sensuality, in the recurring theme of duality that ran through her albums. But until she said those words, no one realized how deeply the 2 lives had intertwined beneath the surface of French pop history. The man who wrote about forbidden desire had passed on something far more subtle, the art of surviving beauty. He had taught her that beauty alone is unbearable, that it must be anchored by sorrow to become real. Vanessa's realization, spoken softly on camera, was not a confession but a kind of liberation. By naming her loneliness, she freed it from secrecy. By acknowledging Gainsbourg's imprint, she reclaimed it as collaboration rather than captivity. At that moment, the audience and perhaps she herself understood that her story was not one of manipulation or mentorship, but of transmission. He had given her the tools, she had given them meaning. And as the film faded to black, her final words lingered like a refrain. I don't sing to be understood. I sing to understand. In that single sentence lay the entire revelation, the paradox of her existence, the quiet miracle of endurance. Vanessa Paradis was no longer the girl Gainsbourg had once taught to whisper. She was the woman who had turned that whisper into her own language. In the end, Vanessa Paradis' story is not about fame, or even music. It is about the invisible architecture of sensitivity, how a single encounter in youth can define the cadence of an entire life. She once said that art, for her, was a way to breathe underwater. The image fits. For all her beauty and elegance, She has lived most of her artistic life submerged half in silence, half in song, translating solitude into something melodic enough to survive. Serge Gainsbourg gave her the language for that survival, but she was the one who turned it into grace. The moral of her journey lies in the transformation of inheritance. She did not repeat her mentor's provocations, she distilled his sadness into serenity. What he expressed through rebellion, she expressed through restraint. What he screamed in irony, she whispered in truth. And in doing so, she proved that emotional intelligence can be louder than scandal, and vulnerability more subversive than desire. Every generation of artists inherits a wound. Vanessa Paradis chose to turn hers into rhythm. The very thing that could have trapped her, the ghost of Gainsbourg. The weight of expectation became the compass of her authenticity. In her world, melancholy is not illness but language, not curse but craft. Perhaps that is why she remains untouched by time. She does not chase relevance, because she has learned that timelessness is born from honesty, not noise. Each performance, each word she utters, still carries that invisible pulse, the rhythm of solitude her mentor once named. There is a strange comfort in her silence now. It is no longer armor, it is authorship. The whisper that once belonged to Serge Gainsbourg has evolved into something unmistakably hers, a soft defiance, a hymn to endurance. And if there is a lesson for those who listen, it is this: sensitivity is not weakness. It is the quiet courage to remain open in a world that rewards noise. Vanessa Paradis stands as proof that the truest art is not born from perfection, but from the fragile balance between longing and peace, between the song that fills the air and the silence that teaches us why it matters.